Hello, I'm Roger Sutton from The Horn Book, and I'm here today with Andrea Davis Pinkney, author of, among many other books, her new book, Martin Rising, Requiem for a King. So did you envision what this book would be when you were writing the manuscript? Did you have an idea of...
I did not envision it. And I'll say as an editor and as an author, I like to publish what is beyond category. So I just knew that I wanted these to be docu-poems that were illustrated. And by the way, I don't even get my choice of illustrators. So Brian Pinkney might not have been the illustrator for this. Thankfully, Diane Hess saw that that may be a good idea. So no, I don't know the format. I don't think about that. I'm just writing it.
And what did the manuscript that you submitted to Diane look like? Because there's spacing is so important in this book, right?
Yes, yes,
From
it is.
page to page, and you know, on some pages we have a lot of text, on some pages we have no text, on
That's
some pages
right.
we have a little text.
That's right.
But does that play a part when you were creating the manuscript?
Yes, absolutely, especially with poems, in this case the docu-poems. Yes, I wanted it to be a certain kind of narrative that was very interactive. Poetry has a reputation of being very quiet, very contemplative. And I did know going in that I want Martin Rising to be not a quiet book. It's very loud. I want it to be very interactive so that the reader can really engage with the poems, kind of dive in and become insulated in what that narrative is all about. So that was one of the things I did kind of know going in and that I had thought about very carefully.
Could you read there's an early poem, right, Martin, his birth.
Yes.
Could you read us that poem?
Sure. I'll read a snippet from it.
Because it'll set up my next question.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So the book chronicles Martin Luther King's life, really the last months leading up to his assassination.
Right.
So, but we open with his birthday and we end on his birthday, which is now Martin Luther King Day. So the opening poem, which is entitled Sparkling-Eyed Child, and all the poems, by the way, are dated, so we know exactly where we are in history. So again, while these are docu-poems and it's poetry, it is also a work of nonfiction. Sparkling-Eyed Child, January 15, 1929. Baby boy born, eyes sparkling, Martin came into this Jim Crow world, brought daylight to this unfair world, this legal to cheat blacks world, with God-given gifts, big voice, sharp mind, sparkling-eyed vision that could see something special in tomorrow's promise. He studied oratory, sociology, theology, and excelled. When he became a full-grown man, he found a place in history as he fulfilled his destiny to fight for full equality, a scholar, preacher, believer, and teacher of what it means to dream. And that's the beginning. So that's how we meet Martin.
That first poem intrigues me. I mean, I think it's a beautifully well-crafted poem in and of itself. And incidentally, one thing I love is that it's an actual poem. So many of the long poetic, sort of the use of poetic long form in books we see in children, to me is prose, broken up into lines of uneven length. And this is actual poetry, so thank you for that.
Thank you, Roger.
But it also is subverted by what goes on to happen in this book. That when I read that first poem, I thought, oh, so we have this nice poetic biography of Martin Luther King. But you move very quickly to the last days of his life. And it took a while for me to catch on to what you were doing. That this wasn't, it is, of course, ultimately about King's life, but the subject of your book is King's death.
Right, exactly.
And that's really something. Was this something you knew you wanted to do from the start, or did that happen as you were writing?
It was definitely something I knew from the start, because there are many books about Martin Luther King Jr., many. And I know for me as a reader, I didn't know much about those final days. And so let me tell you how the book began. I was at a Martin Luther King Day party. There were kids, people, families out on the dance floor. And all of a sudden, the DJ throws on Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And we're all on the dance floor. And there was a moment, And then on top of that, he mixed kind of a rap-infused lyric with the speech lacing through it. And there was a palpable kind of positive energy in the room. And I looked at my husband, Brian, and I just said, Martin Rising. And that was really the beginning. So then I remembered, it kind of took me back to when Martin was assassinated in 1968. I remember it so clearly because my father, a civil rights foot soldier, marched with King, followed King, and I remember him speaking to our congregation about King's life and his tragic death. These three words resonated: peace, good, and dream. So there I was at that party, seeing families, children, 7-year-olds like I was, and I was kind of just ushered back to that moment. Then it came to my attention that it was the 50th anniversary of his assassination that was approaching. And I thought to myself, peace, good, dream. I have no real in-depth knowledge of those days leading up to his death, and that's what I want to write about. Now, I also knew very clearly going in, this is not going to be a sad book. It's divided in 3 sections. So the sections are daylight, when he's born, darkness, those moments leading up to that unfortunate event, and then dawn, which is about the transcendence of a new day. So yes, it was my plan to write about that assassination, but to also lead the reader to that bright moment and where we are hopefully now, which is above and beyond darkness to new things and hope and faith in a bright future.
I think of so many books, particularly for younger children, about Martin Luther King, where the high point is the I Have a Dream speech, right?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
And here, and I think very daringly, the high point is the legacy, that what happened when he died, and maybe even in some ways because he died. Martin Luther King's death had a purpose.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And the book, the kind of background, if you will, is the Memphis sanitation workers' strike of 1968. So there we see Martin, inspiring the strikers, standing behind the workers, but also, there's this crescendo of the I've been to the mountaintop speech. And of course, in researching the book, I listened to the speech many times where he is predicting his death. He says, I may not get there with you. So he feels something is wrong and he's probably not going to live much longer. And, he's kind of telling his followers, but when I'm not here, it's on you. You've got to carry on and keep my legacy going. And that's what I hope the book will do, ultimately.
Well, it's amazing the way that the book manages to be so dark and so bright at the same time.
Thank you.
That's really quite an accomplishment, I think.
And I owe a lot of that to the illustrator, I have to say, to Brian, who was very selective in his palette. So, one of my favorite pieces, obviously, is the cover of the book, because we see Martin, very majestically looking down at the marchers, inspiring them with his vision, while at the same time kind of being inspired by them, who are, are marching and carrying on his legacy. And then you see throughout the book there are moments where it is very dark, and then in the end, ultimately, Brian has used these kind of very luminescent colors in the palette, which are like sunlight, a stained glass window, a new day, and again, that's how the artwork is almost like visual poetry.
I think it was very brave of you to really confront those last dark days for him, because first of all, it gave us a story that we don't know very well.
Right.
I didn't know all the details of that strike in Memphis and the sort of day-by-day actions of what happened. But at the same time, you didn't make yourself conform, and your editor didn't make you conform, and your illustrator didn't conform with a conventional, inspirational, 32-page biography of a hero. Because as an editor, and I know as a librarian and a book reviewer, that we have plenty of those books. They're good to have, they're good for school reports. This is not a school report book, and I mean that with the highest praise.
Thank you, thank you. Although I will say that, also it's my hope that teachers, kids, schools will, as I said, be engaging with the poems, that it's meant to be interactive. And so the poems can be read aloud. They can be read as a group. They can be read in a chorus, if you will. It's my hope that there's a musicality and a harmony that will be achieved when kids engage with the poems and read them aloud.
And isn't it wonderful that now we have, you don't have to worry about being the only Martin Luther King book. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
That we can have different stories about Martin Luther King.
That's right.
As our publishing at least seems to be, knock wood, opening up.
Yes,
right?
let's knock it. Yes.
I mean, do you feel
absolutely.
more freedom now to create sort of more individual books on African American themes?
I do. And again, Martin Rising is something that is, you can't fit it into a genre box necessarily. And I think that, right, part of a function of that is the fact that we are kind of softening those borders. At least that would be my hope.
Yeah.
And that we can tell stories in many, many ways.
Right.
There's many ways to convey a story.
Clearly it has your poetic voice and your own particular imagery, but you don't tell us anything, you don't say anything in here as a fact about Martin Luther King unless it is a fact about Martin Luther King.
Yes, that's right. So in terms of having to conform, if you will, that was the one thing I did have to be very solid in, the factual nonfiction aspects of the book. There's mention of a radio station in which which, by the way, there's a kind of an ongoing narrative about the weather. So even the weather patterns we researched those weather patterns because we see snow was coming at odd times. It happens in the months of February, March, and April. So we see forsythia starting to grow. So Diane Hess and myself, had to really research the weather patterns. We had a radio station which we found out was not the correct radio station that reported on that particular day's weather, so we had to get the correct radio station. So all of those facts are locked down and correct, and that, if you will, was my only scaffolding and structure. Those were things I had to stick with and couldn't change. There was no fluidity with that, with the facts.
Can that also be helpful though? Because
Yes.
You've got to stick to certain things.
Yes.
So
Yes.
because you also write fiction, right? And
Yes.
where you can just go crazy,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
As long as you're convincing. But here you have to hew to
That's right.
an actual story.
That's right.
Well, I think you
Yes.
did a wonderful job, Andrea.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.